Hey buddy, the guy in the comments who keeps asking me to read some little people or gnome stories. Well, strap yourself in, pal, because this episode has what you wanted and so much more. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. Follow me on X at Dark Prevails, cause I get a little lonely sometimes. Today's episode features an assortment of terrifying and allegedly true tales about a were-pit bull, the monster known as the Breather, and little creatures that would make Zach Hadel have a conniption. Enjoy. Send us your stories at darkstories.org if you want me to narrate them. Sign up to become a member at eeriecast.com/plus for members-only bonus content and more. And help us become the biggest and handsomest horror podcast on Earth by leaving Unexplained Encounters a follow and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you. Now, let's begin. The Breather, from Oathbreaker. This story takes place roughly 13 years ago in 2012. I was 17 years old, living in a small town in Pennsylvania. It was a Saturday night, and I had two friends named Tony and Jeremy. The three of us decided to go out for a late-night walk. In my small town, there's a hiking trail that goes along the train tracks. It follows in a huge circle the whole way around the mountain. We call it the Rails to Trails. You can actually use the hiking path to walk from my little town to the one on the opposite side of the mountain in less than a day. This path leads deep into the woods, and it's ill-advised to go there after dark, due to there being no lights. But thanks to cell phones and flashlights, we had all the light we needed. To avoid any unwanted attention from our local police officer, given that we were three teenage boys out after curfew, we decided to head through there. Plenty of kids in my town had little hangout spots, just off the beaten path. Just far enough to have campfires, but close enough to make it easy to access. We walked across town, headed to our favorite spot. It was just on the other small bridge by the creek, only a short walk past the old brick yard my grandparents worked at back in the 60s. We had just crossed over the bridge when we found a dead rabbit just off to the side of the path. Its back had been torn wide open to the point you could physically see where the spine used to be connected to its ribs. Now, despite what they say, there are absolutely mountain lions in Pennsylvania. We carried on, assuming some predator had just killed it, not paying any mind to how fresh the body was. As we walked, something suddenly caught Jeremy's eye. A small, worn path through the trees. "Hey, look at that. Was that always there?" Jeremy whispered. "No, it wasn't," Tony replied. I said we should check it out, that it might lead us to a new spot someone carved out deeper in the forest. The three of us set off, walking along and talking and joking. Tony, as always, had his earbuds in, and didn't hear half the conversation. We walked for what felt like hours. We didn't even notice that the woods had gone totally silent. We still had not come upon anything. No campsites or fires, no people. Just this seemingly endless path. But then, suddenly, there was a loud snap of a branch. We stood there, still as could be. But Tony, with his earbuds in, didn't hear anything and kept on walking. "Tony," I whispered, but he kept going. "Tony," I said, somewhat louder, but still nothing. Finally, I walked over and grabbed his arm, to which he turned around, pulled out one earbud, and yelled, "What the heck?" The woods were dead quiet, just his voice echoing through the trees. That was when we heard a low growl, followed by what sounded like the snapping of bones and a chewing sound. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Jeremy nodded. Tony, still having music blasting in one of his ears, said, "No, what?" There was another snap, and I thought for sure I saw something moving in the dark. I shined my light, but nothing was there. "Guys, there's something circling around us," Jeremy whispered. Leaves began to rustle nearby. Jeremy and I screamed, taking off running. We ran for only what seemed like a minute before we darted through the brush, back onto the rails to trails. We turned back to find no sign of Tony. We waited, listening quietly. Then we heard footsteps. Tony came walking out of the dark. "You guys really ditched me?" he asked. "If you had used your darned ears to listen to something other than your stupid music, maybe you would have heard what we did," I told him. Thoroughly spooked, we decided to just go back to my place. We were just about to the bridge when I noticed I'd lost my phone. Crap, I must have dropped my phone somewhere. I need to go back for it. "I ain't going anywhere. I'm staying here," Tony remarked. I looked over to Jeremy desperately. "My mom will kill me if I lose that phone, dude." Jeremy sighed and agreed to come back with me. As we walked back onto the path, Jeremy finally asked, "What if something attacks us?" I pulled out my pocket knife and gave it to him. "Just use this," I told him. "But what about you?" he asked. I'll admit I was a pretty dumb kid. I thought I was much tougher than I was. So I told him, "I got hands, don't I? I know how to box. I'll punch, you stab." That earned me a much-deserved eye roll from Jeremy. We walked for a few minutes. We heard what sounded like raspy breathing, like a burned person or someone struggling with asthma. It was coming from seemingly random directions at random intervals. Occasionally, we'd hear movement or the snap of a branch, but we pressed on despite feeling really ready to wet ourselves. Finally, we could see the light emanating from my dropped phone, the flashlight pointing straight up. Jeremy stayed back as I walked ahead. The breathing sound grew closer, more erratic, almost excited. I bent down to pick up my phone, and Jeremy screamed. "What is that?" Then he took off running. As his footsteps faded into the dark, in front of me, I saw two pale legs, as if they'd been standing there the whole time. I looked up to see this thing, something with pale gray skin, dark sunken eyes, and what looked like branches jutting out of its body. It had these long, mangy arms and sharp claws, and its teeth were pointed like shark teeth, but pointing in every direction, like they'd been smashed. I'd say it was about 6 or 7 feet tall. Its excited, raspy breathing got louder and more erratic as it opened its mouth. In my panic, with this thing inches in front of me, I grabbed a large branch on the ground and swung. With a loud thud, the creature's body fell to the ground. I grabbed my phone and dropped the branch as I saw the thing pull itself back up. Its body twisted, almost convulsing, into a crab walk until it stood straight up with its back to me. It was like watching Dracula rise from his coffin. I didn't wait for it to turn around. I just ran. In the dark, I heard it screaming, a horrible sound like the call of an elk mixed with a man's death gurgle. I could hear footsteps behind me and tree branches snapping as I ran as fast as I could, but I could tell it was gaining on me. And the moment I thought it surely had me, the footsteps stopped. It fell back, and the screaming went silent. I soon found myself back on the gravel path of the rails to trails. I nearly slipped on the sliding gravel as I turned to run to the bridge. My lungs felt like they were on fire when I made my way to the bridge. I finally stopped to catch my breath. As I heaved, I heard the breathing again. I turned and saw a rabbit impaled on a tree branch, sounds coming from behind the tree. I didn't wait. I took off again, and as I ran, I caught up with Tony and Jeremy, just as they'd reached the brickyard. Jeremy turned when he heard footsteps, seeing me running to them. I practically tackled him as I stopped. left me there, dude! You coward!" I yelled. Jeremy and I proceeded to argue for a while Tony, finally taking off those darned earbuds, asked, "What even happened?" We told him as we realized the path was silent once more. Then we heard it, the sound of bones and chewing again. We wasted no time. I don't think we stopped running until we had exited the rails to trails and were safely back under a streetlight. I was heaving again, desperately trying to catch my breath. I'm not really a runner. We returned to my place, and we stayed up all night, listening, hoping that thing didn't follow us. In the meantime, we told Tony the whole story. The next day, when the sun was up, we returned to the trail, hoping to find the path. But we couldn't. There was no sign of the break in the trees anywhere. The rabbit impaled on the tree and the first rabbit we found were gone too. As we were returning home, I spotted it down by the creek. The water under the bridge had a dead rabbit in it. We went to take a look. Sure enough, broken teeth were jutting out of its body. Its lower half had been completely torn, and a distinct hole was right through its heart. This was the rabbit that had been impaled. My guess is the creature ate its legs, then left it for us to find. A warning. I wondered if the teeth were left behind on the rabbit because I'd hit it so hard with that branch. The next thing it bit into had lost some teeth. The four of us have long since gone our separate ways and don't speak anymore. I don't talk about what we saw that night often. I don't even live in that town anymore. But I did go back to visit my parents last year with my wife and 2 kids. While everyone was in bed sleeping, I took both my guns and decided to go visit that old place. While I never did find again that break in the path, as I was crossing the old bridge, I swear I heard it. The breather, excitedly rasping as it chewed into something. It got just as excited as that night. I think it remembered me. The Little Man, from Raven 97. This story is actually my father's. It happened back in the late 70s near Aberdeen, Maryland, where my father grew up. He would often bring this story up whenever we talked about spooky stuff late at night. Prior to this, my father wasn't a huge believer in this kind of stuff. But after this experience, he was never really the same. The year was 1977. My father was out on a fishing trip. He would often go to relax after work, fishing and drinking a beer, unwinding from his stressful days working at the nearby shoe factory. It was a warm, sunny day, and he was sitting there waiting for a bite. But the fish weren't really active that day. After some time passed, he got up and decided to go explore the woods near the river. He spent a lot of time hunting and fishing around those woods with his friends. It was just him today, though. His buddies had other plans and couldn't join him, so he decided he would go for a walk in the woods alone, just take in the nature around him. He was walking through the woods, kicking rocks and thinking about what he was going to have for dinner that night, when he noticed something pink scurry by. He froze in his tracks and looked in the direction he saw it run off to. Once the thing came into view, it appeared to be a little pink man. Now, I'll explain a little more in detail. He would always describe this little man as being no taller than a can of baked beans, with fleshy pink, wrinkled skin, wearing no clothing. Most striking of all, he had bright blue eyes. My father thought he was losing his mind when suddenly the creature ran off. He decided to trail after it, and after some time passed, he followed it right to a drain pipe on a nearby building. The little man looked at my father with his bright blue eyes and quickly ran off, disappearing inside of the pipe. My dad stood there in disbelief at what he had just witnessed. He went back to gather his fishing gear after this event and found an oddly arranged circle of acorns surrounding it. He gathered everything up and went back home. Whenever he got back, he told his family about the encounter, but they thought my dad was just joking and making things up. He got a similar response from his friends when he told them later. They used to jokingly ask if he was on something when he was out there fishing, but he would always defend himself, saying that what he saw was real, and that all he had in his system was a few sips from that one can of beer. He would always say, "I understand it's hard to believe, but I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it." He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, and wasn't huge into the paranormal, so he had nothing to gain by making something like this up. I believe his weird little tale, although I've never seen anything like what he experienced. His vivid retelling of the adventure is always fresh in my mind. He went back to the same spot with friends, and by himself too, several occasions, hoping to once again see the little man, but he never did see him again. I hope you enjoyed this odd little family story, and if you've experienced something similar to what my father saw that day, I'd love to hear about it. My dog is a hellhound. From Jason6281. I'm not the best storyteller, so bear with me. The story is about a string of events that led me to believe that my 18-month-old German Shepherd, Bear, is a hellhound. I know hellhound sounds really threatening, but to be honest, Bear is a great dog, and I love him to death. I don't believe he has any ill intentions towards me, even if he might be some sort of paranormal entity. It all started the first week of me getting him. I remember I got home from work, took a shower, then just felt wiped out on my bed. I woke up later at around 4 a.m. to see Bear sitting next to me. Normal, right? It would be, if not for the fact that I swear his eyes were glowing a weird red color, and his body seemed to be almost wispy and phantom-like. Again, I apologize for not being too descriptive. I'm doing my best. He stood silently, and I legit thought I was going through sleep paralysis or something. I remember he just stared at me in that form for about 5 minutes, before he got up and walked away to another room. I also wasn't really able to move or speak during that encounter, which led me to believe it was just sleep paralysis. Besides that, I've woken up to several loud bangs and footsteps multiple times in the couple of months I've had him. Bear is also a very quiet dog, which is kind of unusual for his breed. Possibly the strangest thing that has happened is that on my counter, I have a picture of my grandpa and grandma holding me as a baby. For several weeks, Bear would just sit and stare at that photo for hours on end. Even when I tried to play with him or coax him with treats, he would just sit and stare. Then later on, I got the news my grandpa had passed away due to cancer. That's when Bear also stopped staring at the photo. Bear's coat is completely black, and in folklore, hellhounds usually appear as all black canines. I've read that hellhounds guard gates to places like the underworld, so is it a coincidence that my dog, which I presume to be a hellhound, appears as a German Shepherd, one of the most well-known guard dogs? Other dogs also tend to keep away from Bear, and he doesn't really play with any of the other dogs at the dog park. He mostly keeps to himself. Luckily, he's never gotten in a fight with any other dog. Bear also likes to stay outdoors rather than indoors, and I'll sometimes catch him staring at the sky and just not moving. I nearly forgot to mention, the adoption agency I got Bear from told me they found him after several graveyard security guards told them about a large black dog walking around they couldn't catch. In folklore, hellhounds usually hang around graveyards and places where people have passed. In short, I know this story, if you can call it that, isn't as creepy as many others out there. And I don't know for sure if he's a hellhound, but a lot is pointing to the fact that he might be. The Hat Man of Tennessee, from Derpy Ghost. This happened back when I was a little kid living in Tennessee. We had just inherited a little farmhouse that belonged to my grandparents. It sat on a few acres of land bordering the woods. We had just moved into the house and were unpacking the last few boxes. I must have been around 9 years old at the time. I was excitedly running around the house, exploring every nook and cranny. At one point, my mother yelled out to me to finish unpacking my room and stop acting wild. So I walked back into my room and started to take out my toys and games, and of course, getting distracted again. I was sorting through some of my Pokemon cards when I started to hear whistling. I stood up, curiously walking around trying to locate where it was coming from. I didn't have time to find it, however, as my mother had just entered my room, handing me a box of my video games to unpack, telling me to put them away and get ready to head out afterward. She didn't have all her kitchen stuff out yet, so we were going out for dinner. After she left, I didn't hear any more whistling and just shook it off, thinking it might have been a bird outside, or something like that. Later that night, after we got back home, I got in my bed and lay down, staring at the ceiling. I was just taking in the day and feeling excited for my new life here in Tennessee. I started to close my eyes slowly when I heard the whistling again. It was faint, but sounded like it was getting closer. I looked around my room but didn't see anything. I turned over, looking out my window. There, I saw this dark shadow moving around outside. I sat up and looked closer. The shadow was tall. It was pitch black, looked like a silhouette of a man wearing a cowboy-style hat. The shadow man appeared to be flipping a coin in his hand while he whistled and slowly glided by my window. The thing that creeped me out the most was that my room was upstairs. There was no way anything could be standing there outside my window without floating. I ran to my parents' room and told them everything. They, of course, didn't believe me. They tried to convince me it was just a bad dream and let me sleep with them for the night. The next day, I looked around outside, looking up from the ground towards my bedroom window, thinking about what I saw the previous night and how crazy that was. Eventually, I got distracted and ran off, playing games and exploring the new yard. I wandered right to the border of the woods, playing with this stick I found, pretending it was a wizard's staff, when something shiny caught my eye. I looked down to find a golden coin lying on the ground. I picked it up and remembered that the Shadow Man was flipping a similar-looking coin. I decided to put it in my pocket to show my parents later, and I ran back to the house. After I got back inside, my mom had finished unpacking her kitchen things and had dinner ready for us. My dad wanted me to help him finish painting the bathroom after we ate, so I soon forgot all about the coin until bedtime. I climbed into my bed, placing the coin on my nightstand so that I would remember to show my parents in the morning. I then got under my blanket and started to drift off to sleep. But before I fell asleep, I began to hear the sound of faint whistling again. I looked out my window, but this time I didn't see the Shadow Man. I lay there for a while, trying to fall asleep again, but then I got startled by the sound of something clacking on the ground. I sat up, looking in the direction of the noise, which was near the foot of my bed. I saw a glint of gold on the ground. The coin. I sat there staring at it, trying to figure out how it got all the way over there, when I noticed something was now casting a shadow over the coin. I slowly looked up. To my horror, I saw the Hat Man slightly floating off the ground above the coin. He looked over at me and pointed at me. Then he slowly reached down and scooped up the coin. He flipped it in his hand again, then he just vanished. I was frozen in a trance-like state, but snapped out of it when he disappeared. I ran off then, terrified over what had just happened. I remember telling my parents about it, but I was met with the same doubts. It wasn't for another year or so until they too encountered something paranormal. If you guys enjoyed the story, I've got many more creepy tales about this farmhouse that I can tell another time. As for the Hat Man, I never saw him in person again, but I still heard him whistling outside somewhere near those woods every night while I lived in that house. I don't know what he wanted from me that night, but I sure learned a lesson. Never take things that you find in the woods into your house. You never know what may be attached to them. That wasn't a dog. From Anonymous. My first encounter with this thing was back in 2012. I was 14 years old at the time, in a bad living situation. I also had panic attacks, and when I say panic attacks, I mean like my heart was about to jump out of my chest, and my head would feel like I was spinning at about 100 miles per hour. I was heavy set then, around 300 pounds, and I'm still 300 pounds at 25 years old. I was never really into sports despite my linebacker build. I had anger issues too back then, but I would push it down anytime I would get mad. I was living with my mom at the time in Lake Station. She was extremely neglectful and only cared about herself. She had no problem sending me out at 9 o'clock at night, alone in the inky blackness. She would try to send my brother with me, but I cared more about his safety than my own. It didn't help that I was the one taking care of my siblings and myself after my father passed when I was 9, and my mom cared little about him, and immediately began to date these losers and jerks that would abuse us. But as the oldest child, I had to play protector for my siblings, and 9 times out of 10, I'd have to protect her too. I eventually developed this danger radar, which meant I was always especially aware of my surroundings. It was about 9 at night, and I was about to go to bed when she came into my room and said in that disgusting sweet voice I knew all too well, "I need you to go to Grandma's so she can wash my clothes." At the time, our apartment's washing machine was broken. I rolled my eyes and said nothing as I got back out of my pajamas and put my street clothes on. My Gram's house was about 9, maybe 11 blocks or so away from where we lived. My mom had this black trash bag absolutely filled with dirty clothes. That night, something told me I should take a weapon. So I took this little paring knife with me. I left, and I immediately noticed there were no sounds other than my own footsteps. The entire walk to my Gram's, I kept looking over my shoulder, because I felt like I was being watched. I'll admit, I should have just said no to going anywhere, but I knew that she would have been harping on about it. So I went on. I had the trash bag over my shoulder and my right hand in my pocket, holding the knife. Every time I stopped to readjust the bag or catch my breath, I would hear some kind of clicking sound, like the tapping of a screwdriver on brick. That's the best I can describe it. I started to jog at this point, taking shortcuts through people's yards. I'm sure I could have gotten into some trouble for that, but I didn't care. What can I say? I was young, stupid, and scared. I got to my Gram's place absolutely sweaty and winded. My Gram opens the door, clearly confused and not expecting me. She notices the worried expression on my face as she lets me in. Then she says, "Let me guess, your mother sent me her clothes to do," as she took a puff from a cigarette. Now, one thing about my Gram is she loves all her grandkids, and now her great-grandchildren. She just had that nasty habit of smoking, though she never smoked around us as babies. Back to the story. I simply nodded and took the bag to her laundry room. I then came back out to the living room, where she was putting out the cigarette. She had a worried look and said something out of the blue. "Are you doing okay?" At the time, I was a terrible liar. My eyebrows would spaz when I lied. "Yeah, I'm just Andy." Truthfully, though, I was worried about some psycho following me. But I tried to stay calm and collected. My gram would start talking to me and making sure I was okay, which did put me at ease. She always had this calming nature when I was around her. It was probably the only time that I relaxed and let my guard down. She's been more of a mom to me anyway than my own mother. She always cared about me and my siblings, even when my mom kicked her out of our lives for her losers of the week or month. You're probably thinking she gave me a ride home and that I saw something from the safety of a car. Well, you'd be wrong. At the time, her car had a bad starter. It would only work when it wanted to. And that was when my mom called my gram, demanding that I come straight home. My gram started to argue with her, and I didn't want her to have a stroke or anything like that, because she was in poor health. So with a simple, "I love you" and a hug, I took off. This time I took a longer path home just to spite my mother. It was then that I heard the clicking again. In the inky blackness, I could see a pair of glowing orange eyes staring at me. I started to back away, not breaking eye contact. But then, those eyes stood up, towering past 7 feet. I stood about 6'2", so I knew that this thing was taller than me, because I had to look up at it. I kept backing up, watching these eyes, when it stepped under a street lamp. This thing in the light was definitely over 8 feet tall. It was tall and skinny like a runner, completely hairless. It had several scars over pale gray-blue skin. Its head reminded me of a pit bull's, very blocky, ears that were stretched like the Egyptian god Anubis or some kind of jackal creature. I think I was starting to hyperventilate by then. This thing just growled the most guttural sound I'd ever heard. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and I was honestly surprised nobody else came out to investigate. It was that loud. I could feel it shake me to my core. My flight or fight kicked in, and I immediately took off running as fast and hard as I could. And then I heard it running after me. I felt like prey, and I felt like this thing was toying with me. I briefly looked over my shoulder to see it chasing me on all fours with a creepy grin, drool dripping from its maw. I doubled my pace, slipping on some black ice, because once again it was in December. There I was lying on the ground with a nasty gash on my hand, trying to get up. The next thing I knew, this thing grabbed me by the ankle and pulled me near it. It slammed massive arms on each side of my head, staring directly into my eyes, and I thought I was going to die. That the creature was going to swallow me whole and nobody would ever know what happened to me. Then, by reflex, my arm went up, just as the creature was bringing its head down closer to my face. I was holding it back with my forearm. With my right hand, I reached into my left pocket, pulling out the paring knife. I figured this was going to be the last thing I'd ever do, and it might do nothing to it. But my brain was in that state of, if I'm going to die, I'm going to make it remember me at least. I'm going to make it feel some pain. So I rammed it into the creature. I think I got it below the rib cage, because I felt it deflect off bone. It screamed and still tried to bite me, but I got in one more stab as it screamed even more. I took the opportunity to kick it off of me, getting back onto my feet. It stared at me with pure hate and disdain, giving me the feeling it wanted me dead even more. Like, how dare you stab me? You are prey, I am predator. That's when a car's headlights illuminated us. I got a good look at the thing then. Its legs were like the hind legs of a coyote. It had 4-fingered hands, 3 main fingers, and an opposable thumb, with between 4 to 6 inch claws. I noticed the claws were chipped, as if it had been grinding them on metal or concrete. It was only in the car's headlights for a few seconds, before it howled at the top of its lungs and ran off with the paring knife still in its side. I collapsed and blacked out. The next thing I knew, I woke up in the hospital with some stitches in my forearm and shoulder. They said a cop, of all people, had found me blacked out on the side of the road. I had no ID on me. They said I was lucky to have survived an apparent wild dog attack. I know this thing was no dog. I don't know if the cop had his dash cam on or not, but I know that thing was no dog. My second encounter with that creature happened recently, actually. Sunday night as of me posting this. I'm 25 now, living with my grandmother. She's in poor shape and needs assistance. I owe her a lot, so I volunteered to take care of her. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of banging outside. I thought it was either raccoons in the trash can or possibly some peeping Tom. I grabbed this 10-pound sledgehammer and went to see what it was. And there I saw it again. That monstrous thing eating the cat food I left out for a stray cat. It looked up at me before running off and jumping over my fence. I didn't say anything to anyone about it. I just called the cops' non-emergency line and informed them about a potential neighborhood prowler. I'm losing sleep over this now. Was it the very same one I stabbed a decade ago? Am I being targeted? If so, I need to know what it is and how to get rid of it. The Red Cap Affair, from Blinken. I've never shared this story with many people, partly because even mentioning it feels like inviting it back into my life. It happened when I was around 11 or 12, right on that precarious bridge between being a child and a teenager. Though I've grown up since then and live a completely different life now, these memories still haunt me enough to disrupt my sleep on some nights. This all transpired in the Scottish borders, where my family lived for several years, in an old stone cottage at the edge of a sprawling heather moorland. It's the sort of area that has an air of ancient history about it. Crumbling towers tucked behind tall grass, moss-covered walls that look centuries old, and roads that twist through endless fields. Even as a kid, I could sense that the land was steeped in stories far darker than the usual bedtime tales. My father had found steady work in a neighboring town, and he was thrilled to bring his city family closer to nature. My mom, reluctant at first, eventually agreed to the move, looking forward to an escape from the hectic environment we'd come from. The cottage was old but sturdily built, with thick walls that kept the place cool in the summer and just warm enough in the winter. It had one of those fireplaces that demanded a good roaring blaze on chilly nights, filling the rooms with the crackle of logs and the faint smell of ash in the morning. At the time, I didn't pay too much attention to the atmosphere. I was more excited by the freedom of having open spaces around me. I could roam fields, collect stones from the moor, or just hike in my well-worn boots until dusk. Our cottage stood a short walk from a dilapidated ruin that was said to have been a small 14th century watchtower. It wasn't much more than a stump of stone walls with a rotting wooden gate. Local tales said the tower had once belonged to a particularly vicious family line, known in old ballads for their cruelty. As a kid, I wasn't too interested in historical details, only that the ruin made for an exciting place to play, somewhere to duck behind walls and imagine knights or outlaws. Whenever I'd mention going to the tower, Mum would remind me to be careful, warning that a loose stone could cause an accident. Dad was more lenient, but he still insisted I never go there alone. Of course, I tested that rule from time to time. That was how this whole thing started. The first encounter happened on a dreary afternoon in late autumn. The sky was overcast, and the sun had started dipping behind thick clouds. I was wandering the perimeter of the ruin, kicking at stray rocks, trying to find a decent place to sit and peer over the moor. My father had gone to town. My mother was busy inside, and I had permission to explore so long as I stayed nearby. That's when I heard footsteps, At first, I thought it was a trick of the wind sweeping through the broken tower. But these footsteps weren't the heavy crunch of a boot on gravel. They were clipped, as though someone wore hard-soled shoes, maybe even metal-soled ones. They came from the other side of the ruin wall, beyond a tall patch of grass. Curious but uneasy, I poked my head around a corner, expecting to see perhaps an older local or some adventurous tourist. Instead, I glimpsed a small figure, no taller than a short adult, but built in a wiry, angular way. He wore dark garments that looked worn and tattered, and though I couldn't see his face clearly, I noticed the top of his head was a deep, rusty red. It could have been a hat, I thought, or maybe unkempt hair. The color stood out starkly against the gloom of the stone. He stopped walking and tilted his head, as though he knew someone was watching him. I held my breath. Every instinct told me to pull back and stay hidden. But I was a kid. Curiosity won out. I took one step forward, snapping a twig underfoot. The figure spun around, and I saw a flash of a face that was pallid, with a slightly pointed chin and eyes that gleamed unnaturally. There was definitely a hat on his head, something like a skull cap, but it was dripping with a deep red color. Instantly, the stories my grandmother used to tell about redcaps came to mind. I'd dismissed them as old folk tales, yet here I was, staring at what felt like a living nightmare. We locked eyes for a second, maybe two, before I bolted back toward the cottage. I had never run so fast. My mother was alarmed when I burst in, panting and sweating despite the cold air. I told her I'd seen someone skulking around the old ruin, that he looked strange, and she scanned me for injuries before peering out the window. She saw nothing. She tried to convince me I was letting my imagination run wild. For the next week or so, I avoided going near the tower. The rest of the area felt safe enough, especially when the sun was high. I took my time to adjust to my new routine. Chores in the morning, reading comic books in my bedroom, occasionally wandering down a dirt path that led to a small stream. If I ever thought about the tower, I'd remember that eerie face and feel my stomach twist. Then, one evening, around twilight, I was outside gathering firewood. The cottage's back window faced the moor, and the ruin sat off to the right behind a slope. As I piled wood into my arms, I caught a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. I glanced up, and there he was again, standing on a small ridge near the tower. The same figure, the same red cap, though it looked darker in the fading light. He stood completely still, his posture reminding me of a crow perched on a branch. My heart began to pound, dread building in my stomach like a heavy stone. He lifted a hand and made a subtle motion, almost like beckoning. I froze. I could have dashed inside, but something in that gesture compelled me to stare. The figure seemed more distinct in the gloom, his limbs lean and long. I thought I saw the glint of something metallic near his feet. The local stories about redcaps mentioned heavy iron boots or some iron-shod staff. I wasn't sure what I was looking at. All I knew was that my breath caught in my throat and the hair on my neck stood on end. Eventually, the figure stepped back, melting into the shadows by the ruin. I dropped the wood and ran inside. My mother gave me a funny look, but she didn't question me. That night, I barely slept. I heard faint tapping noises or a light scraping sound under the windowsill. Once, I thought I heard a low cackle, but it could have been the wind. My mind was full of swirling fear and half-remembered folk tales. Somewhere around dawn, I finally drifted off into an uneasy slumber. In the following days, I felt watched anytime I stepped outside. even if I was just crossing the yard to toss scraps on the compost heap. I sensed a presence lurking behind tall grasses or hidden in the heather. I noticed small footprints in the mud along the path near the tower, too tiny to be an adult's, but oddly shaped. One print had a slight pattern, like hammered metal. There were also reddish stains on stones near the ruin. I tried telling myself it was silt or algae, but it looked wrong. I kept most of this to myself, fearing my parents wouldn't believe me. It got worse after I found the dead rabbit. It was a crisp afternoon with the sun actually shining. I decided to face my fear by revisiting the tower in broad daylight, hoping to reassure myself there was nothing monstrous there. Near the old wooden gate to the ruin, I saw a white shape on the ground. It was a rabbit lying on its side. From a distance, it looked oddly twisted. Approaching, I realized its fur was smeared with something dark and sticky. The metallic smell told me it was blood. Its neck had been slashed as though by claws or a blade. My stomach lurched, and I knelt, trying to steady myself. Footprints in the grass led away from the rabbit, straight into the tower's interior. They were small, childlike, and fresh. A cold fear gripped me. Then I heard a soft scrape of stone on stone inside the ruin. My mind screamed to run, but for a moment I was rooted in place. The wind shifted, carrying a foul stench of old, wet iron. That was enough to unglue my feet. I scrambled back and sprinted home, tears threatening to spill from my eyes. I told my father about the dead rabbit near the tower, though I was careful not to give too many details. He concluded it must have been a fox or a weasel. I insisted it seemed more like a knife wound, but he dismissed it. He said he'd keep an eye on the area, then reminded me to stay away from the ruin. That same night, he went out before dark and returned looking puzzled, saying he found nothing unusual. I silently stewed in dread, knowing he hadn't spotted the footprints or the deeper signs. From then on, I stayed mostly indoors. The atmosphere felt suffocating, like something oppressive clinging to my every step. I tried to focus on normal routines, helping Mum, reading books, or playing games. But near dusk, I'd glance out the windows and often catch a flicker of movement, something short slipping behind the walls, or a flash of red. Once, I thought I saw a narrow grin. Each time I'd do a double take, and it would vanish, leaving my heart racing. One evening, I had to fetch water from the outdoor pump. As I stood by the old handle, I heard a scraping noise behind me. Turning, I saw him again. The redcap stood maybe 20 feet away, short but with unnaturally long arms. His clothes were ragged, revealing patches of sallow skin. His boots gleamed with rivets or nails, and that cap on his head looked wet with fresh crimson. His face was all sharp angles and bulging dark eyes. He grinned, displaying small, pointed teeth, and tapped a thin, iron-tipped staff against the ground. I was petrified. It was like a waking nightmare, each breath catching in my throat. He took a step closer, dragging the staff so it made a gritty noise in the gravel. I staggered backward, barely keeping my balance. Somehow, adrenaline kicked in. I turned and ran as fast as my legs would carry me, bursting into the house. My father, alarmed, grabbed a lantern and a shovel and went out. He found no tracks, no footprints, nothing. I couldn't believe it. I described every detail to him, but he only grew more doubtful, suggesting it might have been a fox with mange or my imagination. That was the night I realized there was something truly uncanny about this creature. It didn't leave normal signs behind, or maybe it moved too fast to be caught. Either way, I knew it wasn't just a person. It was a redcap, or something close enough to that legend. Winter came, bringing heavy snows that turned the landscape into a white desert. Our cottage was chilly and drafty, but it was safer inside than out on the moor. Despite the snow, I kept thinking I could see movement at the edge of our property. I'd spot small shapes in the distance. Sometimes it was just a hare darting across the field, but I'd recoil, imagining the redcap lurking. Late one afternoon, I was helping Mum peel potatoes in the kitchen. The windows were fogged from the heat of the stove. A sudden tap on the glass made both of us jump. She went to wipe the condensation, and for an instant I saw confusion on her face. She muttered that it was a strange shape, but the figure vanished almost immediately. Peering out, I saw him crouching near a low stone wall, a flash of that terrible red hat. The moment Mum looked again, he was gone. She said it might have been a dog. I felt my heart sink, knowing how wrong she was. As winter wore on, I found odd scratches on the bark of trees close to our home, crude shapes like a cap or boot. I smelled iron more than once, that acrid tang near our fence. Twice I found little splashes of dark red near the doorstep, which my father brushed off as paint or some mess left by wildlife. My mother grew uneasy, but never fully grasped what was happening. She just sensed the tension between me and the outdoors. Then came the worst encounter, in mid-January, close to dawn. I couldn't sleep and was pacing in my room, my breath puffing visibly in the cold. A scraping noise sounded at the back door. Not a knock, but a deliberate scratch, like something sharp dragged across the wood. My heart hammered in my chest. A fox? A dog? Then I heard a small, high-pitched chuckle. The blood drained from my face. I crept into the hallway. The scraping continued, followed by another unsettling giggle. Cautiously, I moved closer, each step feeling like it might betray me with a creak of the floor. Through the thin gap under the door, I saw two shadows, small and pointed. They seemed to be feet or boots, and the outline of a staff tapping against the threshold. The door rattled as if tested, and I feared the lock wouldn't hold. I didn't dare make a sound. Finally, the footsteps retreated across the porch, each accompanied by a tap of metal on stone. I relaxed for a split second, then heard a low, muffled voice. It sounded almost like my name, hissed in a guttural tone. Silence followed, and eventually I found the courage to breathe. At dawn, I checked the door. No footprints were visible. The wind must have drifted snow over them, but there was a scratch etched into the wood, resembling a droplet atop a crude drawing of a cap. My father assumed it was from some animal. I knew better. We moved that spring, not because they fully believed my tales, but because Dad got a job offer in a larger city. I was relieved and yet resentful, relieved to escape, resentful that no one had believed me. On the last day, loading the car, I glanced toward the ruin. For a moment, I saw a crouched shape among the broken stones, a flash of red in the sunlight. I turned away, unwilling to look again. We drove off, and I haven't returned since. That was nearly 2 decades ago, yet I remember the terror vividly. I've read more about redcap lore, learning how they dye their hats in blood, haunt old towers, and torment intruders who stray into their domain. I'm convinced that's exactly what happened. I trespassed near his old tower, and he marked me. He never directly attacked me. He didn't need to. The fear was more than enough for him. Sometimes I dream about those footsteps or that iron smell. In those dreams, the door splinters and he steps inside, cap glistening. I can't see ruined towers now without feeling a jolt of anxiety. When I'm in the countryside, I scan for a flash of red or the tap of iron boots. Thankfully, I haven't seen him again. Still, I can't shake the belief that something ancient and malevolent prowls those remote corners of the Scottish borders. That's the reality I lived, and whether it sounds believable or not, it shaped who I became. If you ever find yourself near a crumbling old tower, keep your eyes open, and if you do see a small figure in a blood-red cap, do yourself a favor. Get away from there and don't look back. Look, I know this episode talked about a bunch of scary, smaller folk stories, okay? But that doesn't give you an excuse to go out and find 5'8" manlets like me and bully them. Because if you don't stop, they'll eventually rise up and... No, they can't do that. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and you can follow me on X at Dark Prevails, where we discuss conspiracy theories about glitter. Help us grow exponentially by following and rating Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Sign up to be a member at eeriecast.com/plus to unlock exclusive access to members-only content. And as always, send me your scary stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org. Thank you. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.